On June 30th, 1931, a portly man sits before the defendant's stand in the Chicago Federal Courthouse, nervously wiping his brow with a white handkerchief. An employee of the Internal Revenue Service rises to the witness stand and begins to drone on about missing tax returns and unreported income. Without context, this scene appears about as mundane and boring as can be. However, millions more recognize this court proceeding for what it is: the technicality that allowed the United States justice system to finally catch the most notorious mobster of all time. Indeed, to many, the era of the speakeasy, the Tommy gun, and the illicit bootlegger need no introduction. But how did criminals like Al Capone grow so powerful? Welcome to the latest video in our series on organized crime, where we will explore the origins of the American mobsters and explain how the era of Prohibition allowed them to become some of the most powerful criminals in world history. Our story begins in the late 19th century, the beginning of a massive wave of immigration to the United States. As war, poverty, oppression, and famine rocked their homelands, millions of Irish, Southern Italians, and Eastern European Jews crossed the Atlantic in search of new opportunities. In 1892, the iconic Federal Processing Station on Ellis Island opened its doors. But as thousands of migrants passed through its crowded lines each day, they soon found that the United States was not quite the dreamland they hoped it to be. Nativist sentiment was strong amongst the upper crust of American society, and many movements sprung up as a result. These cultural conservatives claimed that the United States was founded upon the principles of an Anglo-Saxon Protestant society and had no place for the Jews or the Catholics. Consequently, new migrants were often denied respectable jobs, forced to perform menial labor while being crammed into slums like the infamous 5 Points in New York, where poor families were stuffed into homes built atop landfills amidst tanneries and glue factories. Most immigrants made the most of the hand dealt to them and worked hard to provide for their families. Others turned to more insidious means to make ends meet. The story of organized crime in America begins as early as the 1830s, with the rise of a handful of predominantly Irish gangs in the slums of New York. The most prominent of these gangs was known as the Dead Rabbits. Based out of the poverty-stricken 5 Points, they arose as a defiant movement against class oppression imposed on poor Irishmen. Consequently, their main rival, the Bowery Boys gang, was a xenophobic posse of Protestant American-born nativists, led by Bill the Butcher Poole. The gangs fought street battles with knives, hatchets, spiked clubs, brass knuckles, tomahawks, and muskets, and their conflict became an inspiration for Herbert Asbury's 1927 nonfiction book, The Gangs of New York, and its movie adaptation by Martin Scorsese. The most prominent leader of the Dead Rabbits was John Old Smoke Morrissey, a professional boxer who had made his fortune in prize fights, even becoming the champion of America in 1853. Morrissey soon took his violent lifestyle to the streets of 5 Points, having his most bitter rival Bill Poole gunned down in a Broadway saloon in a morbid statement against anti-Irish activism. In the following years, Morrissey had become the king of New York's gambling scene, owning racetracks and clubs that attracted such prestigious guests as Mark Twain, John D. Rockefeller, and Ulysses S. Grant. Morrissey was soon so influential that with the help of the Democratic Party political organization known as Tammany Hall, he was elected into the United States Congress in 1867, where he always looked out for the Irish, using strong-arm tactics to accomplish his goals. The story of his life left a dubious legacy. Felonious violence was a valid path to wealth for the disenfranchised immigrants. Throughout the 1880s and 1890s, new waves of Jewish and Italian migrants would arrive to carve a place for themselves in the streets of New York and beyond. Out of Manhattan's Lower East End, a charismatic thug named Monk Eastman knit together an insidious order made up predominantly of young Jews from Brooklyn. His organization became known as the Eastman Gang, and he became a local kingpin in gambling, prostitution, opium dealing, and violent extortion. Eastman's main rival was Paolo Antonio Vaccarelli, known better by his Americanized name, Paul Kelly. Styling himself as a sophisticated gentleman, Kelly made a name as a dexterous flyweight boxer. Riding the fame of his victories in the ring to open up several brothels and clubs, he eventually cobbled together the largest and most vicious Italian mob in New York. By 1901, Kelly and Eastman's cronies were locked in a bloody turf war in the Lower East Side. Consequently, the two gangs were also in the pocket of Tammany Hall, who used the violent mobsters to further their political goals in the New York State Legislature through bribery, extortion, and voter fraud. In order to enforce a peace between the two, Tammany Hall organized a boxing match between Kelly and Eastman to determine the fate of their gang war. The two mob bosses beat each other bloody for 2 hours, but the match ended in a draw and the war resumed. Not all the gangs in New York were started by impoverished laborers. Some had deep ties to well-established secret societies which had been formed in Italy decades earlier and carried over to the United States by its powerful criminals. Two of these groups were the Camorra and the infamous Cosa Nostra, whose rise to power in 19th century Sicily we have covered in a previous video. Meanwhile, Irish gangs held out against the Jewish and Italian advance. Morrissey's Dead Rabbit Society had long since been absorbed into the Five Points Gang, but many Irish factions that remained united to form the White Hand Gang, named in juxtaposition to the Italians, who practiced a form of extortionism known as Black Hand violence. It should be noted that not all these gangs were divided entirely on ethnic lines. For example, some Jews served under the Five Points Gang, while some Italians worked for the Eastmen. Plenty of Irishmen, alongside Poles, Slovaks, and other marginalized immigrant communities, were present in all gangs. At the turn of the century, the foundations had been laid for an era of lawlessness in the heart of the United States. But it would be 2 decades later that a certain constitutional amendment would pass, allowing the mobsters of America to explode in prominence and initiating an age of criminal kings who ruled by right of barley, hops, and rye.